This Choircast podcast is brought to you by my book, God, Sex, and Rich People, A Recovering Evangelical Testimony. What happens when an evangelical pastor's daughter moves from Branson, Missouri to the Big Apple? A collapse of identity that begins a journey of figuring out faith, fucking, and the 1%. I wrote this book so I could share with humor and raw honesty the realities of reinventing my spirituality and sexuality in the city that never sleeps and never stops sleeping around. Available now on Amazon.
Western Christianity has spent the last 2,000 years telling everyone they're separated from God.
This is Not Church with John and Nat Turney.
Could you one time just kick it, Kyle? I missed the boat with Keith when he was on. I don't think he really got the KG joke.
Yeah, that's fine. Not everybody gets it.
I know. Not everyone can be as erudite as those of us who are Tenacious D fans and know who KG is. But anyway, hey, welcome back to the podcast, everybody. My name is Nat, with my brother John. Say hi, John.
Hi, John.
John is rocking the Beatles T-shirt in I don't even know. Is that like irony of something? No, you're a Beatles fan.
I'm a huge Beatles fan. You know that.
Do I know that? I don't even think I know you anymore.
Oh, okay.
I don't know. But anyway, this is the podcast that you have either intentionally or unintentionally clicked onto. Don't give up on us just yet. This is the thing we call This Is Not Church, because if it was church, you would have left by now. And John and I would be happy to escort you out of the building and come with you, by the way. That sounds like we'd be like those deacons. Remember that guy? I went to church one time and was like asked to leave because I wore a hat in the sanctuary.
Oh!
Did you tell him that your hat was actually on the sanctuary?
I tried, but I wasn't old enough. I think I was like 13. And so I think my very, very cultured response was, whatever, man. I'm like, wait. And then later on, I'm like, there's scriptures actually that say that men should pray with their heads covered. And I was yelled at for having a hat on and saying, I don't know. There's just so much weirdness that happens. But anyway, I shouldn't ramble anymore. We should just get on to introducing our guest. Today we have with us Scott M. Coley, who's a lecturer in philosophy at Mount St. Mary's University. His research interests include philosophy, religion, moral epistemology, and political philosophy. Say those three things really fast together. Epistemology is a word that I stumble over quite a bit, but he's also the author of a new book called Ministers of Propaganda, Truth, Power, and the Ideology of the Religious Right. Welcome to the podcast, Scott. How are you, sir?
I'm great. Thank you. It's delightful to be here. And I realized that I chimed in there before I was formally introduced, which is probably a faux pas.
Oh, that's all right. If it hasn't already become apparent, we play by a very loose set of rules here. So there's not much of a structure. I think the only thing we ever say every time is, I think there's probably been podcasts where I have forgotten to mention the name of the podcast. But my assumption is if you clicked on it, I mean, you're not surprised that that's what happened.
Shouldn't be.
So, but then again, maybe you thought you were going to listen to something else and you're completely surprised. But anyway, if you don't mind, we'll just jump off with one of our sort of standard questions. If you wouldn't mind just maybe giving us a little bit more background on yourself, a little more, so maybe fill in the blanks. That was an awfully great and concise bio, by the way. Some of them are quite long. Yours was short, sweet, and to the point. But if you wouldn't mind maybe elaborating a little bit, give us a little bit of your background, it'd be great.
Sure. So I grew up in the church. I've been, I guess, what would qualify as evangelical more or less my entire life. I guess I came to embrace more politically liberal or progressive, relatively speaking, viewpoints into adulthood. So maybe mid to late 20s started. Well, one important realization through studying theology is that, the God of the Hebrew Bible is frequently angry. And it turns out, I learned in studying theology, that often, almost always, the thing that God is angry about is institutional injustice. And that sort of made a lot of what didn't really make sense in the Hebrew Bible kind of fall into place. And then, of course, just living a bit of life and just realizing that sort of, that the, I guess, strict libertarian economic paradigm is not exactly, doesn't really map onto reality, at least not in my experience.
It's almost like there's a massive propaganda machine that has told us for our whole lives that capitalism is great. And John and I both grew up in the 80s. We were born in the 70s, but, conscious really in the 80s. So we lived through all of Reagan's trickle-down economics bullshit. And seemed like it didn't ever actually work that way. But
still waiting for it to trickle down.
Still waiting for it. Yeah, corporate CEOs are making billions of dollars while, screaming about how they can't pay a living wage to their employees. There's all kinds of great stuff in there. But let's talk a little bit. I know that just because it's in the title of your book, let's talk about this idea of propaganda, though. Because to me, while it shouldn't, that word propaganda and church so sadly go hand in hand. So I don't know if maybe you want to elaborate on your use of that term.
Sure. So propaganda comes in a variety of forms. We see it in literature, film, art, like painting, that kind of thing, oration. The kind of propaganda that I deal with in the book is specifically form of propaganda that shows up as rhetoric that appeals to some ideal, political ideal, moral ideal, intellectual ideal. So it's rhetoric that appeals to some ideal in service to an agenda or an argument that in fact undermines that very ideal. So it's rhetoric that's ultimately self-defeating. But of course, people who are adherents of the kind of ideology that's being reinforced by the propaganda, they don't recognize it as propaganda because ideology functions within a kind of ecosystem that tends to obscure what's actually going on. And so what the book is about is sort of unpacking how that ecosystem functions.
Yeah. Well, so, that has to have been in play on some level forever, right?
I don't know about forever.
But it seems like it's coming to sharp focus. But does it seem like it's sort of culminated in what we've lived through in the last 4 to 6 years? At least that.
Oh, I see. Okay. So my book sort of traces, I pull some examples from the 19th century, but sort of in the introduction. But as far as the more detailed historical treatment, I go back to about the middle of the 20th century. But these, the dynamics that I analyze, I think come into rather sharp focus around 2015 or 2016. And I'm happy to say that I don't mention the 45th president very much. He appears in a couple instances on one page of the book, but I think in both cases it's like the indirect object in a sentence because I was introducing Wayne Grudem, and so really it wasn't even about the president. But in any case, there are any number of interesting analyses out there of that administration. But as far as I'm concerned, and I think there's a lot of research to back this up, this is a symptom. It's really not the underlying problem. And it's a symptom that sort of, as I say, it threw things into pretty sharp focus, particularly for those of us who lived through the Clinton administration. It's pretty difficult not to see the, I guess, contrasting attitudes about the importance of character in leadership.
It's difficult to not see it, and yet so many people sort of handle that with aplomb. They seem to just
that's a good way of putting it.
Right? They just kind of brush
very
it
diplomatic.
aside. Yeah, I'm like, well, John's and my example is the same. We're brothers, if you didn't know the story. So, and our father is someone that we love and respect a tremendous amount. But we've had knockdown dragouts about that exact thing. Because I was alive and in my 20s when Clinton was dragged through, and rightfully so. Actually, my opinions on whether he was rightfully or wrong, whatever, have shifted more as I've come into sort of think of like his misuse of power, less so about his dalliance and more so about the power dynamics involved with that. But
yeah, I'm not here to defend Bill Clinton.
Right? No, not at all.
Absolutely not.
Again, I think he was wrong, but I think now my opinion is, he was wrong for different reasons, if that makes sense. In my 20s, it was the moral outrage of how, and that was my dad's moral outrage was, you can't trust any man who would cheat on his wife. And I'm like, really? Seems like you don't have a problem with a serial actual adulterer here, and one who's probably committed several acts of sexual assault. But anyway, so that was the weird contrast for us as well. But that was when you mentioned somehow, like when ideology becomes the goal, you can push aside a lot of other things in service to that ideology, right? I mean, at least that's been my experience.
Yeah. So, an important feature of ideology is motivated reasoning. And that is what it sounds like. It's reasoning that's motivated by self-interest. It's the reason, and by the way, all humans are afflicted by motivated reasoning. I analyze some of the motivated reasoning that happens on the religious right because that's the subject of the book. And I suspect some people will say, well, what about the left? What about the left? That's not, it sounds like, you wish I had written a book on a different subject. That's just not the subject of the book. But yeah, everyone engages in motivated reasoning. It's the reason why we expect judges to recuse themselves from cases where their material interests might be impacted by the outcome of the case. It's not because we assume that judges don't have integrity, right? I mean, some judges may have more integrity than others, but you could take a judge who has whose integrity is unassailable. But we understand that when one's material interests are affected by the outcome of a case, their very perception of things is apt to be affected.
No, you're right. I mean, and you're right to point out that it happens on all along the spectrum, right? But I do get tired of the whataboutisms and the false equivalencies that tend to be drawn by folks who are, again, in service of their own agenda and ideology.
I may end up writing a book at some point about propaganda and ideology on the political left. But at this point, as I argue in the book, I think the biggest threat to our political community is very much coming from the religious right. And so that's why I chose to focus on that in this book. And I don't see any evidence of that changing anytime soon. So if I don't end up writing a book about ideology and propaganda on the left, that may be why.
Right. Right. Yeah. Well, it's interesting because then those two things is that we've had a few different guests on who have written and spoken about like the rise of the moral majority, this rise of what we now see as as evangelicalism as less of a religious movement and more of a political component, right? That uses religious imagery and ideology to further a political agenda that may absolutely, and I like what you said at the very beginning, which actually undermines a lot of their supposed religious beliefs. And so it would actually stand in stark contrast to even the things that I think they would reject Jesus outright, most of them, because he's #woke or whatever. But this ideology gets pushed forward in service of what they would say maybe is a greater purpose or greater ideology. Does that sound fair?
Well, so I guess I would just contrast the argument that I make with, I think what you're describing, and I'll do that in this way. One thing that someone might do, and this is interesting in its own way, one thing that someone might do is point to certain theological positions and describe the ways in which certain theological positions prop up and perpetuate the power and privilege of the people adopting those theological positions and say, well, look, isn't it obvious that these people are just using the resources of religion to advance social arrangements and social hierarchies that serve their own interests? Isn't it obvious? And so isn't it all, on all the religious claims illegitimate? As I say, that's interesting, on some level. But I don't quite do that. I take a lot of care in the book to address the theological positions that I treat sort of on their own terms, right? So, for example, I have 2 chapters on young earth creationism and creation science, right? Because one thing I might do, but this has already been done, is to sort of say, look how the creation science movement, serves certain social objectives, right? But what I do is I say, all right, let's look at the theological arguments for young earth creationism or complementarianism or, i.e. patriarchy or racial hierarchy, whatever it is, right? Let's look at the theological arguments or the philosophical arguments such as they are, And it turns out that the arguments just aren't very good. So, and it's typically for pretty basic reasons, at least the arguments I analyze in the book, the popular arguments. Well, then a very natural question to ask is, well, why do they keep making these arguments if they're not good? And then I think it's interesting to analyze how the positions that are being argued for badly, serve the interests of those putting forward the bad arguments. And furthermore, I think it's interesting not only to consider the feedback loop between theology and sort of political positions. So I'm interested in how certain political positions have been shaped by conservative evangelical theology, but also how conservative evangelical theology has been shaped by the political positions or social arrangements themselves, right? And that's sort of how I define ideology in the book, is this feedback loop between belief and practice, right? If I had written this book 10 years ago, I would have said something like, in the before times, I would have said something like, evangelicals are confused about the moral salience of institutions, and that's why they embrace policy positions that are, I think, antithetic to the morality that I gather from the sweep of Scripture, right? And so evangelicals adopt bad practices and embrace bad policies because of bad thinking. Now, I still think that's true, but I think that's an incomplete picture of the situation. It's important that bad thinking leads to bad practice, but it's equally important to recognize that bad practice leads to bad thinking. That's the feedback loop that constitutes ideology.
One of the things that kind of comes to mind to me is like during the Reagan years, right? The rise of the moral majority during Reagan, and how he didn't toe the line in some ways, right? To the point where he angered the religious right or the moral majority. And so they had to come up with like a new plan on how they can double down on some of this ideology. Does that make sense?
So you mean how Reagan was always making promises to the Jerry Falwells that he was going to put forward certain policies, and it never quite materialized? Right.
But he was supposedly like their golden child, right? The one that they had propped up to do what they expected of him, and then he didn't. So I feel like that was the beginning of them taking a stronger grip on the religion or the religious right or the right, the conservative right. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that one of the things that Reagan did, I can't get inside Reagan's head. I don't know exactly how much of it was conscious or strategic. He sort of flattered the religious right in ways that they hadn't, that we hadn't seen since the 1950s.
Well, he really courted them, didn't he? I mean, it was almost like a courtship of the religious right.
Oh, absolutely. Right. I mean, there's this famous speech where he stands up and he says, I know that you can't endorse me. By the way, background, that's because of the Johnson Amendment. It used to be that churches, and by virtue of their tax exemption, were not supposed to endorse particular politicians. I believe that this is still the case as a matter of law. It's just sort of basically ignored these days. But they were a bit more tactful about things in the 1980s, at least in terms of like the literal words that they said. And so Reagan stands up and he says, I know that you can't endorse me, but I want you to know that I endorse you. Right. And you can just see all the folks on the religious right just getting the warm fuzzies. Right. I think he got a standing ovation at that point.
He likes us. He really likes us.
Yeah. He wants to know what we think,
Right.
I think of this maneuver as kind of the reverse Richelieu. So there's this, figure, Cardinal Richelieu in the Three Musketeers, I think. And he's this like shadowy figure behind the scenes who's actually pulling the strings, as it were. But what you have in the religious right in the Reagan era is the exact opposite, right? So they're out front getting their picture taken. They're in the White House, but actually they're not really controlling much of anything, But just for the sake of photo ops and, a fancy breakfast once a year, they're willing to go all in on this political party. But on some levels, they were getting what they wanted, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, even a seat at the table was a step way forward, right? I mean, what I was going to say was that it feels like Reagan was ahead of his time in recognizing that voting bloc that was still coalescing. Like they really didn't have, they were coming up with an identity, the Falwells and those guys were beginning to form this thing that we now recognize as the moral majority, evangelical, whatever you want to call them. But I feel like, again, not that I'm giving Reagan credit for this, although it is giving him credit for something I think that ended up being not great. But I think he was ahead of his time in recognizing that group would become very powerful at some point. And it made sense to at least pay lip service to being on their side, if that makes any sense.
Sure. And he, he on some levels seems to have recognized, at least in terms of how he approached things practically, seems to have recognized on some level just how cheaply they could be bought.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's something that has paid dividends, hasn't it? Because now they can be bought dirt cheap. I mean, I know we're here we're not here to specifically talk about, number 45, but I thought that was something that, to me was painfully obvious what he was doing. As a former evangelical, actually at the time, I still was technically in an evangelical church setting. I remember thinking and expressing to lots of my friends, like, you understand what he's doing? Like, this guy's not religious at all. He's pandering to all of you. And you're all just eating it up.
And it was so obvious that you might have thought that they weren't going to buy it. And I really thought going in, well, this is going to be the dissolution of the Reagan coalition.
Yeah, exactly.
Foolishly.
Yeah, naively.
There are others who absolutely saw it coming and weren't the least bit surprised, like Kristen Dumais.
Yeah, she's brilliant. Yeah, I know she saw it coming.
Yeah, and that's it's like, okay, I need to listen to that person, because their outlook predicted this or retrodicted this, in this case. It explains all the data. I was floored, but it wasn't the dissolution of the Reagan coalition. It was the culmination of it.
Yeah. I mean, it was the concentrating of it, really. I mean, right? It was like the focus of it.
You look back and you see all the threads, right? And there are periodic changes in rhetoric.
Yeah. But the unabashed way, I mean, the absolute sort of, I'm missing the word I'm looking for, but it was brazen.
Transparent.
Yeah. There was nothing subtle about any of it. And I recall, and I've talked to John, we've talked to I recall in the beginning when he was a candidate and there were still 10 or 12 other people on the stage and it wasn't really clear he was going to be the nominee. You could fairly openly criticize. And I didn't lose a bunch of friends over it. And they were all, because, Ted Cruz was still around and Marco Rubio was still around. And there were several viable candidates. And as those went by the wayside and all of a sudden the focus became that person, I found that I could not. And I still can't. I can go on my Facebook page today and write something scathing about him. And I'll get, a whole bunch of people going, yeah. And I get a whole bunch more people sending me private messages telling me I'm going to hell. And I need to repent and support God's chosen anointed one. So none of that has changed. It's all still just as shitty. So it's I don't know. I'm less optimistic than I was in 2016. I don't know how we dodged this bullet a second time, but
I'm not optimistic at all about the near term. Regardless of how the next election goes, we're headed for quite a bit of unpleasantness as a political community. Regardless.
Well, let me ask you this, because you bring up in the opening part of your book, you bring up something that's I think is very, very interesting and important. But you bring up this anti-intellectualism. So I'm sort of dovetailing that with stuff like young Earth creationism and hell, even the flat earthers and all these people that QAnon, the rise of things like talk about that how those things interplay with one another, because it does seem like that's on the rise.
Sure. So actually, the core of the project, as I started to develop the book, was the bit about creation science and young Earth creationism, because that's when. So there's always been this anti-intellectual, sort of anti-establishment thread in evangelicalism going back to the beginning, more or less. But it starts to get a lot more acute in the middle of the 20th century. And I wouldn't go so far as to say that creation science is sort of the watershed for the onset of this more acute kind of anti-intellectualism, but it coincides with it, and it's, I think, illustrates with a lot of clarity the way that sort of the intellectual ghettoization of white evangelicals has emerged, and the way that it contributes to mechanisms of social control, and the way that evangelicalism has sort of, when I say intellectual ghettoization, I mean white evangelicals sort of have their own experts over and against quote unquote secular experts, but only when their cultural or political interests are at stake, right? White evangelicals have no special reservations about taking their cholesterol medication. They fly on airplanes. They ask Siri. They use GPS navigation. But when it comes to their economic interests, perceived economic self-interest, or political, when expertise starts to threaten political policies that they favor, then all of a sudden they're very skeptical about the scientific establishment.
So we can talk about, say, like climate change, right? I mean, the numbers have to be pretty staggeringly high on the side of white evangelicals who deny that there's any such thing as man-made climate change.
Yeah, I don't know off the top. I mean, I cite the statistics in the book as of 2020 or something like that. But it's, I think, when you combine the evangelicals who deny that climate change is real at all with the evangelicals who say that climate change is real, but it's not an effect of any kind of human activity, you get to a majority. A majority of white evangelicals either deny that climate change is the result of human activity, or that it's even a thing at all. Between those two groups, you're well over 50%.
Yeah, and that's nuts. I mean,
yeah. Well, this is what happens when you tell 3 generations of white evangelicals that the scientific establishment and mainstream media are disseminating disinformation.
Right.
Which is exactly what the creation science industry has been doing. And even if you, are a broadly conservative evangelical who doesn't buy young Earth creationism, because you're a scientist, let's say, like an engineer or something like that. And so you're like, yeah, I mean, creation science that's not really serious. Young Earth creationism isn't really serious, because you don't need to sort of specialize in geology or paleontology. There's some really basic science.
Yeah. Middle school science will get you there.
That will tell you, maybe you need to do some physics to get to like billions of years old, but there's really basic stuff that will get you to at least hundreds of thousands of years old.
Yeah. Pretty
so even if you're a conservative evangelical who doesn't really buy young Earth creationism, just sort of being in an environment where expertise is so casually called into question, it has an effect on how you view traditional gatekeeping institutions.
And you saw that really in stark relief during the COVID crisis. I mean, there's the science deniers who might not be young Earth creationists, but they do have an overabundance of skepticism when it comes to the so-called scientific community. So the vaccine was panned, and misinformation was spewed around. Masks, obviously, the use of masks was denigrated. We were, all called. I live in Texas, man. Nobody wore masks in Texas hardly. I mean, through the whole goddamn thing, it was like I'm not going to put that diaper on my face, and we didn't stop. And I live in a mid-sized town, and honestly, we shut down for about a month, and then everyone was like, screw this, we're not doing this. But we were so insulated from it that we got away with it for several months. And then all of a sudden we had a spike in cases and deaths, and people we knew all of a sudden, because there was that whole thing of like, do you know anyone who's gotten sick? And all of a sudden we knew lots of people and handfuls of people who had passed away. But that's the real, I mean, there's all kinds of like sort of abstract notions of the detriment that can be caused by science denial. But that is the real rubber meets the road, like possible impact of like, hey, we don't accept this science, so we're just going to take our chances. And it's interesting. Let me ask you this though, because it seems like white evangelicals, since the rise of the moral majority, have been in search of causes, and it seems like they have, as they have knocked one down or so, so they obviously pro-life movement was a huge part of that movement early on, and all of a sudden, well, they've defeated Roe versus Wade. What's the next, boogeyman we can attack? So now they're going to attack LGBTQ folks. And the next one to me seems like the one that's on the rise is this creation science, this insistence that it be taught alongside, more widely accepted. Does that make sense? Are we just seeing a move from one to the next to have another, something else to put in the platform?
So that insistence has been, that's been around for a while, about this sort of equal time kind of deal. And let's see, I think a parallel case that's maybe sort of more recent development would be concerns about critical race theory.
Oh yeah, they really hate that.
Right. And by the way, I mean, critical race theory is not being taught in elementary schools. And now it may be the case that the teachers teaching in the elementary school or whatever took a class in college, as an education major, where some aspects of what started out as, critical race theory in sort of a legal context, worked their way into the curriculum that folks studied in their education major. And maybe they found some of it compelling, and that might show up sort of in some of the assumptions that they approached the teaching with. And if you don't like that, I mean, you got to ask yourself, well, why do public school teachers tend to be, more, I want to be careful how I say this, because I don't want to lend any credence to this notion that all public school teachers are, trying to indoctrinate kids with like gender ideology or whatever. That's just simply not true. But I think in general, public school teachers tend to be more on the liberal or progressive side of things than conservatives. Well, I mean, sorry, but like these are the folks who tend to value public education more. That's who the teachers are going to be, right? In any case, I don't deny that there's some influence from a critical race theory that shows up in teachers' colleges. But your second grade teacher absolutely is not teaching kids critical race theory. It's just simply not true. And often what these folks are objecting to is not even, it actually doesn't even have anything to do with critical race theory. It's just U.S. history. Right? And so any kind of discussion of systemic injustice or racial injustice concerning the facts of American history is hugely objectionable. And what I argue in the book is that actually this, on the surface, this may look like a disagreement about the facts of American history. So you've got one version of history over here and then another version of history over here. But actually, it's not a disagreement about the details of American history. It's a disagreement about the discipline of history as an enterprise. Some people think that history should be about sort of the people, facts, material conditions in our nation's past. And how that sort of got us to the present and what we might learn from it. Other people would like to see history approached more as this exercise in building a certain kind of consciousness based around nostalgia for a certain vision of American identity and this kind of thing. right? And so ultimately, it's not that cultural conservatives or those on the religious right specifically are advancing one vision of American history rather than another, right? It's not that they're promoting a certain view of history over another. They're promoting mythology rather than history, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So it's not history versus history. It's mythology versus history. And that feeds into their identity as sort of the heirs to the American founding, and thus the rightful sort of in-group. America is theirs, and they can take it back by violence if necessary.
Well, I was just going to say, but don't we see this through this like anti-intellectualism throughout, and specifically in public schools, because we see this notion of banning books, which definitely is there's definitely there's propaganda behind that. There's definitely specific reasons why they want certain books, which is usually sexist or racist in its background. Then you have anti-sex education. You have, like you say, you brought up critical race theory because they think it's being taught in public schools, but it's not. I mean, this isn't anything new, right?
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, the attacks on public education are multifaceted, right? And a lot of I'll just say the attacks seem to have started around the time that the federal government insisted on enforcing the Supreme Court's ruling in Brown v. Board. Incidentally, but perhaps not coincidentally, this is when you start to see a massive growth in white evangelical enthusiasm for creation science. So the idea is like, no, we're not taking our kids out of public schools for any reasons to do with, racial integration or anything like that. We want to teach them about the origins of the earth in the way that we understand it. We don't want them being taught evolution. We want them being taught creation science. That's why we're leaving. We don't want our kids learning, about where babies come from, in this public school health class or whatever. We want to do it in this other way, but nothing to do with integration. Certainly not. Perish the thought.
Right. No, absolutely.
And I don't want to say that all anyone involved in Christian education is on some level racist or opposed to integration or whatever. I'm not. That's absolutely not what I'm claiming. What I'm saying is that you see a massive growth in this kind of movement right around that time, in the 1960s, and a lot of the people promoting it were on the record favoring racial segregation. But I think by the 1980s or something like that, you have, Christian schools popping up that are, I think, can't plausibly be connected to that kind of motivation.
I think people would be surprised, especially younger people would be surprised to know that there were times in this country's history where, we went to court over stuff like this. I mean, I'm thinking about, we had Janet Kellogg Ray, who wrote a book called The God of Monkey Science, which was about the Snopes monkey trial, which was a massive case against teaching that was challenging the teaching of evolution in public school.
And one of the things that's fascinating about this, right, is that the folks arguing, for creationism in 1925, the Scopes trial, they were not arguing for young Earth creationism.
Right.
That the Earth is 6,000 years old. That, in fact, that position was regarded as so ridiculous, even by, I think, a majority of fundamentalists. Not to mention even evangelicals as a whole. Young Earth creationism was considered so ridiculous that it was sort of dismissed as a straw man.
Right. Yeah.
You're attributing this position to us to discredit us, but
just to make us look ridiculous, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And then by the 1970s, it's like somehow you're outside the bounds of Christian orthodoxy if you don't think the Earth was created 6,000 years ago, 7,000 years ago. Well, how'd that come to be?
Well, and now we have a whole bunch.
That's what interests
right,
me. That was where the project started. Was like, why does it? The arguments in the 1960s aren't new. They've been around since at least the 1920s, and somehow that they only really took off in the U.S.
That's also very true.
So why is that? Well, if you attend to the social and cultural circumstances, then all of a sudden things start to come into focus.
I mean, don't feel bad, Europe. There are parts of Europe that are catching up to our lunacy.
It's a cultural export of the United States where creation science is taking off.
Well, it's interesting because I see a lot of these people now that social media and the rise of things like YouTube can allow people to go out and promulgate their views fairly easily and say, well, I'm doing my own research. And what they mean is they're watching YouTube videos by self-proclaimed experts with no background in anything, making bold assertions about how radiometric dating can't be trusted. And, like there's this big conspiracy to hide the shape of the earth or to hide how, it's nuts. But it's that two-edged sword of, we used to think there's no such thing as too much information. And it turns out there might just be, especially when half of it is just, dubious at best. It's like, we just propaganda.
There's an interesting book. I forget that it's a journalist who wrote it, and I think he's born in Russia, but now he's based in the UK or the US. It's called "Everything Is Possible and Nothing Is True."
Okay,
and it's about sort of the way that the Soviets, although this would be in the era after the Soviet Union had dissolved, but in Russia, in sort of totalitarian systems, there's this effort to control information, to control access to information, and at a certain point, it became impossible to, with the internet and so forth, to actually stop the flow of information. And so then there was a change in strategy, which is we're just going to flood the zone with information, and people won't be able to distinguish, what's true from what's false. I mean, you almost have to have, some kind of advanced degree in, here's what liberal arts is good for, to be able to discern like, oh, this guy's contradicting himself. Like this can't be legit.
Right.
But you can't expect, the average citizen, and this is not, I don't mean this to be patronizing or whatever. Like I'm very, very glad that people have mechanical expertise, so that I can have a car and have plumbing and air conditioning and so on and so forth. But like, the average HVAC guy, as great as he is at fixing my HVAC, which I could never do myself, is not going to be an expert in distinguishing, misinformation based on logical tensions that emerge, or whatever. And so you just flood the zone. And people, what do people embrace? They end up embracing what they, the source is telling them what they want to hear. That's human nature.
But it's as simple sometimes as just not understanding even basic stuff. We weren't taught how to identify things like logical fallacies. Like now I can listen to people go, man, everything you just said falls into a classic. Like that one, that's an ad hominem. That's a, reductio ad absurdum. That's a, like, none of like this is all garbage, but they can do it sometimes in a compelling enough way, and like you said, and reinforce biases that people already have. That they, that's it's that confirmation bias comes into play, and all of a sudden this guy's saying what I like to hear. I think of a guy like Joe Rogan, who is not a particularly brilliant guy. Smart enough.
He's just asking questions. He's just asking questions.
It's just such an irresponsible way to let people have a massive audience and say stupid shit. Like Chris Tucker, is it Chris Tucker? That guy, I hate that guy. Hate's a wrong word. I'm a
Tucker Carlson?
Guy. Tucker Carlson. Thank you. Chris Tucker's a comedian who I like very much. Tucker Carlson was on Joe Rogan's show and made some little quip about Joe Rogan's prefaces his question with, well, if evolution is true, and he says, well, is it? And then they go on a 10 or 15 minute, little rabbit trail about, well, Joe Rogan's not an expert on any of that. So you really can't challenge the things that Tucker Carlson is
And Tucker Carlson does not.
He doesn't understand.
I would be shocked if Tucker Carlson believes for a second.
Right. Yeah. It's just nuts though, right? I mean, that's where you talk about like people aren't necessarily equipped to discern, because if they're not challenged on it, if they're just allowed to read their talking points and say what they want to say, and you don't have any reason to necessarily disbelieve them, all of a sudden you go, well, maybe it is all bullshit. Maybe they didn't make this all up. Maybe they're hiding the dinosaurs. They're not even real. Next thing you know, you got a whole thing. But your book kind of culminates, it looks like, at the end where you start talking about authoritarianism. And I think that's a good place to kind of say, well, because to me, that seems like the logical conclusion of this is we advocate a lot of this, and we end up with people who are so-called strong. So I don't know. I don't want to give too much of the book away because we want people to buy it, but that makes a good place to land.
So the different positions I analyze with the ideology of the religious right, you sort of go down the list and you tick off all of the classic features of, an authoritarian ideology. And so that's one sense in which it's authoritarian, but another sense in which it's authoritarian is there are growing affinities between those on the religious right in the United States and sort of international, at the risk of sounding conspiratorial. I mean, I document in a lot of detail, for example, the affinities between conservatives in the United States, many of whom are figures on the religious right, and, the soft authoritarian regime of Viktor Orban in Hungary. Tucker Carlson, we just mentioned, Rod Dreher, his apparently good friend, and folks in the national conservative movement are all pretty invested in, some of them on the record, in the notion that anti-democratic political maneuvers are the future of the conservative movement in the United States, which is pretty alarming.
Yeah, very.
So,
but it does dovetail with a lot of evangelical ideology, which is all centered around,
absolutely,
so
they're sort of fellow travelers,
right?
Ideologically speaking.
I mean, I grew up in churches where the pastor was authoritarian. His way was his way or the highway. He set the agenda. He pushed everything through. Our job was to get in line and support the vision of that person. So it doesn't shock me at all that they would want that kind of leader. The problem is if they were honest about it, they would realize if there was an authoritarian who was pushing an agenda they didn't like, they'd be the first ones to yell foul and say, no, this is not what America's about. But
yeah, there's a reason they're attracted to sort of, they're predisposed to accept kind of strongman tactics, provided that they're pushing in the direction that they want.
Yeah, exactly. So that is the danger. That's what I really appreciate. So we want to respect your time. I know you need to get going. Just as a reminder, the book is Ministers of Propaganda. I'm sure it's out right. It's out right now, is it, or is it coming out?
Yeah, it came out on June 4th.
Awesome. So we want to encourage everyone to go out and get a copy, check it out, and we'll make sure to connect to all that stuff in our show notes. Make sure people know how to find you and connect with you however you can. So, man, I tell you what, thank you so much for giving us the time. I appreciate you coming on.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
Thank you for listening to This Is Not Church. Be sure to rate and review the podcast on your platform of choice. If you would like to partner with us, visit patreon.com/thisisnotchurch, where you will receive exclusive content such as early access to episodes, videos of upcoming episodes, and live Q&A sessions. Be sure to check out our Facebook group or follow us on Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode.